Well, thank you for agreeing to do Blogging Heads with me. This is an episode of the Fireside Chats Blogging Heads, which are organized by the Roosevelt Institute. I should introduce myself. I'm Mark Schmitt. I'm a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, and I'm really happy to be doing this with a former colleague of mine. Actually, a lot of Blogging Heads that I've been doing recently have been former colleagues of one kind or another. Why don't you introduce yourself, Jamelle, and then I'll go back and we'll talk a little bit about what I want to talk about, what we both want to talk about today.
Alrighty, my name is Jamelle Bouie. I'm a writing fellow at the American Prospect, and I'm also a Nobler fellow at the Nation Institute.
Terrific, and of course you and I were colleagues when I was the executive editor of the American Prospect, and I was, I totally enjoyed working with you, and I was glad to see that this week you have the cover story in the next issue of the American Prospect, which is about Mitt Romney's economics, and I thought it was a terrific piece, and I think it gives rise to a lot of interesting questions, and so I want to talk about that, and also a little bit about some of the things that some of the elements of Romney's economic language that are new. Kind of really in the last few days since you wrote this piece.
Yeah.
So maybe kind of bring it up to date a little bit. But there are also a couple points I want to kind of challenge you on. So maybe just do the 10-second, 30-second version of the argument in the piece that's called Mitt Romney's Servant of the Right.
Sure. So the main argument has two parts. The first is to show that despite the common perception that Mitt Romney is a moderate, or the real Romney is a moderate or whatnot, that the policies he's pushing in his economic plans and his rhetoric are very much in line with the mainstream of the Republican Party, which is pretty far to the right at this point. So he's kind of pushing a variation on the Paul Ryan budget, which itself has, his version goes a bit further in some regards, a bit less further in other regards, but in general is right where most Republicans are, which means big tax cuts for high earners, dramatic cuts to social services, dramatic cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, increases to the military budget, and devolution of a lot of services to the state. The second part of the argument, I guess the meta argument, is that the idea that Mitt Romney will somehow not be, I think Mitt Romney's talked about as if he isn't really a member of the Republican Party and not really a part of this coalition. And so this allows people to say stuff like, well, he's just pandering to them right now, but if he's elected, he will go back to being, the moderate he was in Massachusetts or whatnot. But I think it's a mistake to assume that the Romney who ran in Massachusetts is somehow the real Romney. I think that the actual Romney is probably a fairly conservative guy. Well,
what if there is no real Romney?
I mean, so I think there is. I have a hard time believing that anyone is formless and shapeless in their views. I don't think that the quote-unquote real Romney is as conservative as the Romney is running for president, nor do I think he's as moderate as one who's governor of Massachusetts. I think like most men of his wealth in his generation, he holds center-right views on most things, and he's able to shape those views to fit the electorate. Peter Suderman at Reason, I believe, called this a business consulting approach to politics, that you can think of the electorate as the client, and he simply, fits his views to reflect whoever the client is. Right. So I think it's very odd and very dangerous to assume that if Romney were elected, he would somehow be moderate. And this, as president, his client is the Republican Party as well as the United States. And the Republican Party at this moment, like I said earlier, is pretty far to the right. And I think we could reliably assume that a Romney presidency would be to the right, more conservative than George W. Bush is. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say at all. And so that was longer than 30 seconds, but that is the argument in short.
Right. And then that raises a couple. I mean, if it's a business consulting approach, which I think is right, obviously the client has changed a little bit.
Right.
I mean, at some point, and why doesn't that make him completely formless? in a sense. If it's just a matter of, you walk into that boardroom and first you have to appeal to the crusty old CEO, and then once you have the crusty old CEO, you have a completely different pitch for, I don't know, the board members or whoever else has to make that decision about hiring, being consulting or whatever. I mean, at this point, when one client is sold, you move on to the next, right? And I don't know how that isn't the equivalent of formless.
I guess I'm making an unstated distinction between, like I said, I have a hard time imagining a human being who does not have views on things. So I guess Mitt Romney may effectively be formless, just for his approach to politics results in a politician who, for the most part, is formless. But we know that Romney is a devout Mormon. We know that he has a particular kind of technocratic approach to problems. So I think those two things combined yields you a person with views that he is able to just set aside for the circumstances.
Right. I mean, but you make the case in the article that, we sometimes think, well, he'll be a relatively pragmatic. Maybe the distinction between pragmatic and ideologue is more complicated than we sometimes think it is. But you make the point that, well, people think if the real Romney is kind of pragmatic, we'll kind of be okay, right? I mean, he won't take the sort of the really crazy kind of Paul Ryan type move. But you make a good case that he doesn't really have permission to be particularly pragmatic, right?
Right, or rather, I think he'll be pragmatic in the service. Like, he'll be pragmatic within the boundaries established by the Republican Party. And so, if the goal is let's really lower tax rates on rich people, I think he'll do what he needs to do to lower tax rates on rich people. And if that means doing something that may seem moderate, I think he'll do it as long as the outcome is what Republicans want. I think, that the relevant analogy is the Affordable Care Act, right? The goal was universal coverage. How that happened was, I think, less important. I think in terms of, ideology, really, it was less important than getting there. Right. So, it's a conservative policy for liberal ends, and I think Mitt Romney was willing to, make a moderate move for a conservative end. But I think people need to remember that the conservative end is there.
Right. I guess one really good part of the article is where you really lay out what this plan actually means in practice. That if you really feed this into the computer and say this is the way the United States is governed, we cap federal spending at 20%, we actually increase defense, we lower tax rates, particularly at the top. You have a situation where there really is no Medicaid to speak of. There are no food stamps. There are no Pell Grants. There's none of this. I mean, I think there are two responses, right, to the way you portray Romney. One is people who still think there's a real Romney that's just a little different and maybe more humane. And I'm totally with you that whether you're in the view that he's totally stripped himself of any actual views, or that he's actually a very conservative Republican, doesn't really matter. I mean, I think you're right about that. But we've all seen the game where the Republican talk about budgets and cuts, and I've seen it for a lot longer than you, because I came to, I was first working on the Hill in 1990. So, when the Republican talk about cuts is huge, but in fact they don't really want to pay the price of having those things come in reality. So it's easy to talk about, all those, lazy poor people on Medicaid and food stamps or whatever, but actually making the cuts, and particularly making the cuts to Medicare, and particularly making the cuts to things that really do affect the middle class, is a huge political risk. So they've always played you're enough of a political scientist to know the old thesis from the 1960s that Americans are philosophically conservative but operationally liberal.
Right.
So you can feed them a lot of conservative talk, but you really don't want to push that button.
Right.
And what's the case that this time they really do want to push that button? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I'm still, obviously in the piece, I was like pretty certain for the sake of like the argument, but I'm still 60-40 on this. But the case is that I think there's a meaningful difference between the Republicans elected in the last couple of years and those elected even in the early part of the Bush administration or whatever. That you have a set of members who genuinely do believe, like as a matter of principle, that programs like Medicaid, that these social programs are unneeded or harmful or whatever, and they genuinely see themselves as having an opportunity to do something about it. I think that, given if Romney gets elected, and in all likelihood there's a Republican Senate as well, because of just how people typically don't split ticket vote, you'll have I think a maybe not once in a generation, but once in a decade chance to do these things, to really try to cement conservative principles into the fabric of American governance. And so why not? Right? Like, why, if you have this population in the House and the Senate of conservatives who genuinely think these things need to be done, if they continuously say that they want to do these things and they're given an opportunity to do them with a pliable president, then I just don't see why they wouldn't happen. Maybe I'm not necessarily, maybe I'm not cynical enough, but I just think that...
Well, I mean, part of it is because people like John Boehner think, do we really want to do this?
Right.
We have a sweet deal where we get the tax cuts we want, or even a Grover Norquist. I mean, I remember, years ago, Grover Norquist will say things like, I want the taxes to be lower, and I kind of want the spending to be lower, but I don't care what the gap between them is.
Right.
Which is basically, there's basically this deal of, if they have the low taxes, they don't really care about the rest, and they didn't care about it at the time they did Medicare Part D and everything else.
That's right.
The mainstream. I mean, by that I really just mean the mainstream Boehner types.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mainstream Boehner types, the McConnell types, I don't think they care either way, right? Like, I think they're happy to get the tax cuts if it results in deficits, whatever. If they have, they may not like Medicaid, but they're not, it's sort of we want the tax cuts. Everything else is, what happens. But the Tea Partiers and right-wing conservatives elected in 2010, the ones who will likely be elected in 2012, the ones who will likely be elected in 2014, assuming if the Republican Party wins and this faction seems even more ascendant, the ones who will continue winning, they all want to see these programs go. They campaign on these programs being gone. They pass budgets in which these programs no longer exist. And so I just can't,
Right.
Maybe I'm willing to say that maybe they would, walk back a little bit, but this is sort of where the GOP is, and it's filled with enough people who want to do it. But I think that with the opportunity, they'd go for it.
Right. No, but they also do, in 2010, they campaign on the idea that, Obama cut $500 billion from Medicaid. Right. So they're still, happy to use the same pitch in the other direction.
Yeah. I mean, I think what we're sort of seeing in terms of rhetoric is they are the GOP is far more of a generational party, right? Like they're defending the benefits of current old people against encouragement from anyone younger. And so that totally fits their policy priorities. Keeping Medicare the way it is for the next 15 years, keeping Social Security the way it is for the next 15 years.
And there's a big distinction in a lot of Tea Party rhetoric, and this comes out in the book by Theda Scotch-Paul and Vanessa Williamson and others. There's this distinction that the grassroots base on the far right draws between Social Security and Medicare, which are things that they paid into.
Right.
And if they're older, they paid into them. And then everything else, which is just, giveaways.
Right. back last September, I was in South Carolina just to kind of do a going around the towns and like sitting in on Tea Party meetings and sort of getting a sense of what people were thinking. And I talked to a bunch of people who said basically the same thing, that when asked about cuts to Social Security or cuts to Medicare, they would say, listen, I don't care what you do with everything else, but I paid into this. This is my money.
Right. So, but I mean, we've never really seen a party that takes that actually draws such a sharp generational line.
No, it's
go ahead. It's a big gamble. And it puts yourself. It also puts yourself on the side of people who are less likely to be around in the future, as opposed to people who are going to be around in the future, right? I mean, it's a big gamble politically. Well, what do you think about the more, in the last week or so, we've seen some different speeches from Romney on the economy, and a couple really interesting dimensions to that, because obviously now he is presenting himself to a different client. The PowerPoint presentation has to take a different form. So there are a couple of interesting aspects that have been added to the rhetoric, right? One is, it's still as in the speech he gave in Des Moines the other day, for example, where he talks about the budget deficit as a prairie fire that we're feeding every day. We don't solve it. He's got great little stuff in here, like we're borrowing money from foreign countries we'll never even visit. He's got a little bit of just xenophobia right there. But he's also got this whole distinction between that he's drawing between Obama and Bill Clinton. And he says, for example, Bill Clinton announced the era of big government is over. Even a McGovern campaign worker like President Clinton was signaling to his party that Democrats should no longer try to govern by proposing a new program for every problem. And then Romney says, President Obama tucked away the Clinton doctrine in his large drawer of discarded ideas. Yeah. What do you make of that element of the way Romney's now presenting his economic vision?
I think it's actually a really clever way of trying to claim the center without having to actually repudiate anything he said in the past, of walking that line. When you invoke Bill Clinton, you say that President Obama belongs to a failed liberalism, and that Democrats like Bill Clinton are actually okay. They recognize that small government is ideal, and they're reformers, and we should elect another reformer. And I think that's what that is. He's saying, listen, America, yes, I'm a Republican, but I'm a reform Republican. I am not, if Bill Clinton, what Bill Clinton was to, Mondale or Dukakis, I am to George Bush. So don't worry.
Right, but he's sort of saying he's more to the right. I mean, Clinton was clearly saying I'm just a smidgen to the right of Walter Mondale, even though those distinctions are really somewhat exaggerated. But Romney's basically still saying that he's to the right of George Bush. I mean, he and Paul Ryan view Bush and Bush Sr. and Reagan as all in some sense sellouts, right? I mean, their reformism is to say we're not going to cut these deals that got cut in the past.
Right. I mean, I don't think Romney's saying that to the public. He definitely said that during the Republican primaries, but as far as the general election is concerned, I don't think. I mean, what's interesting about the Bill Clinton comparison is that aside from the dig at Obama's liberalism, it is almost devoid of ideological content about Romney. It's simply it's a positional thing. It's saying those warm feelings you have about Bill Clinton, you should have about them Me Too, and not about Barack Obama.
Right.
I think it's it's a clever strategy. I think it has one big glaring weakness, and that is Bill Clinton's still alive.
Right. And he can bring down the hammer very hard on that anytime he wants.
Right. I mean, if Bill Clinton were not alive, I could see the real appeal of that. But because Bill Clinton is alive and a very, enthusiastic Democratic campaigner, I just can't imagine that this is a good idea for Romney. He should probably back off of it. Because it's an invitation. Even if Bill Clinton has some reluctance to really go all out for Obama's reelection,
it kind of pulls him in.
Right. Yeah, you're right. It's an invitation for him to say, no, Obama's actually the heir to my political legacy. Mitt Romney is trying to rob you blind.
Right, and then there's another interesting aspect of the new language that that I think is interesting, and you saw it first emerge in like a column by Greg Mankiw, who's one of his economic advisors, which is this attempt to sort of square the circle of his Obamacare in Massachusetts and or not Romneycare in Massachusetts and. I remember Tim Pawlenty used to call it Obamacare. We should keep that alive. To sort of square the circle with the kind of federalism language, and he has this elaborate theory about, he has this section about how smartphones improved because of competition among the companies, and that actually this is the reason why you don't want Washington to do things, because states compete the same way companies do. The states compete to provide better and less expensive services and products, and this is exactly why you need to get things out of Washington. I mean, this is and Mankiw tried to dress this up in real economics, but didn't have anything to back it up with, because there are very few places where that's the case, right? I mean, it's a really kind of bizarre bit of economic theory.
No, I can't off the top of my head imagine any. I mean, people don't move to states like that, right? That's just sort of a weird misunderstanding of human behavior. Like no one, like I'm sure there are plenty of places better than Virginia in terms of social services or like efficiency or whatever. But I have a very deep attachment to Virginia, and so I want to live there for that reason.
Right. Like, I mean, and there are probably few. I live in Washington D.C. by choice. I live so close to the Maryland line that a neighbor of mine said, everybody who lives in this neighborhood lives here because we actively, aggressively want to live within the boundary of the District of Columbia. and yet, it's not the most efficient place in the world, although it's vastly improved from when I lived here in the 90s. It's a very, very strange theory. I mean, there are cases, obviously. I mean, it is almost like the business consultants theory, right? Like there's one, Boeing moves to South Carolina because low taxes, no labor, no unions. Those things do happen, but a lot of companies don't make that move, and that's the only kind of case where that's something on that scale even makes any sense.
Right. I mean,
certainly not just individuals.
Taxes in New York City are very high on high-income earners, but all of Wall Street's there, right? Like it's
right. Of course, there are a couple exceptions. Like one of the appeals of the Miami Heat to LeBron James was there's no state income tax.
Right. I mean, I will.
We don't run our country for the benefit of LeBron James's taxes.
I will say though, if you think of that rhetoric in terms of what has emerged as sort of the GOP position on economics with regards to the states, it does make a lot of sense. The southern model of low service, low tax, and sort of catering completely to business. Because you're right on that dimension, this does happen. The South has made itself a haven for lots of manufacturers because the states don't provide much in the way of services, and they keep their taxes low. And if I know Scott Walker in Wisconsin wants to import that model to his state, John Kasich in Ohio to his state. I mean, like Republicans in the Midwest and the North are trying to import that model. And so I don't necessarily think this is a piece of code from Romney, but when considered in the broader context, it does make sense.
Right. It's not a race to improve. It's a race to the bottom.
Right.
A term we sometimes use in those kinds of when states are kind of competing in that way, and it sometimes gets set up. Like I remember, in welfare reform, for example, they created this competition where you get a bonus if you reduce your welfare caseload more, which southern states that already had low caseloads had no hesitation about competing for that bonus.
Right.
By changing the model.
What's funny, and this is something I've noticed in Romney's rhetoric since becoming, I guess, the not yet official but presumptive nominee, is that oftentimes he is describing things that should have already happening. Like in a speech, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, he said that he wanted he wanted to bring competition to education and improve education through competition, not through big federal mandates. But that's exactly what's happening. Race to the top.
In the aptly named race to the top.
Right. Like the Obama administration is actually doing something like that. Or when he describes his alternative to the Affordable Care Act, he'll say, I want to create regulated markets so that people can compete for health insurance. Well, that's part of the Affordable Care Act. That's a real thing that's currently happening. And I find it very interesting. I find that approach very interesting, that rather than try to, for as much as Romney says that he's presenting a choice, what he seems to be doing rhetorically is blurring distinctions, of saying, his pitch to the public seems to be, the economy's not good, you don't like Obama, I am inoffensive and competent, and I won't change things too much. So you should
but then he also has to be the spokesman for the Ryan plan. And he also has to have this economic plan that would change things a lot.
Right.
So it's a question of how do you present those two faces simultaneously.
Right. And I think it also presents a dilemma for Democrats. Like, how do you critique a candidate who on one hand tries to blur distinctions, on the other hand is actually pushing a plan that is to the right of George W. Bush's. And I'm not sure that Democrats have really figured out a way to go about that. The Bain Capital thing, the Romney folks have gotten better at deflecting that, and while it may work, I think on the margins, I'm not sure that it's something that you can really run on. Attacking him as a right-winger, I think for most people, Romney does not come across as a right-winger, in part because the way we talk about extremism is very much rooted in affect and not necessarily substance.
Right.
And so I don't know. Democrats have been hesitant to use George W. Bush's name in this election, but I think they ought to. I think if you're going to go after a candidate like Romney, then your best bet is to tie him to the past.
Right, and also a past that really tells the story of, remember the last time you had a sort of affable, moderate seeming.
Right, exactly.
Upper class, a guy, look what you got, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, first son of a politician. Good. Well, I want to talk a little bit. It's a great piece, and I highly recommend it. And I think it really launches an interesting conversation. It will be really, it'd be really interesting to see over the course of the next several months how Romney manages these kind of two messages. The actual plan, which is really quite radical, and the presentation, which has to find ways, like with the Clinton example, of seeming kind of moderate. But I want to shift to something to a somewhat different topic, which is the yesterday's story about a rich guy who I had not heard of before, really, or I don't think I'd really heard of him, named Joe Ricketts, and the plan that he had apparently been presented, maybe hadn't approved, of running a bunch of ads against Obama, or actually a short film about Obama that would be accompanied by a bunch of ads that would essentially do, what the what's his name, the big government guy, Andrew.
Breitbart.
Andrew Breitbart was calling the vetting. Essentially this idea that there were all these horrible things about Obama that McCain didn't have the guts to go after, and so the public didn't know these things in 2008, particularly about Reverend Jeremiah Wright. And now it's time to do the vetting, and this wonderful plan that the New York Times published in full that included the great phrase, we elected Obama thinking he was a black metrosexual Abraham Lincoln, and in fact we got this crazy radical loon, which in some ways echoes the Obama speech about the Romney speech we were just talking about we kind of thought Obama was maybe okay, and we didn't really realize he was actually way to the left of even Bill Clinton, and even Bill Clinton, the former McGovern campaign worker, so by association, even to the left of George McGovern, really a '60s radical. I have to say, I think that the universal reaction to the Ricketts story yesterday, from you wrote a piece about it, Matt Iglesias, whatever. The universal reaction was, "Bring it on!" Right?
Right. I think it was "Bring it on" / like really.
Yeah.
That maybe you could have gotten away with something like that in 2008 when Obama was pretty unfamiliar.
Right.
Though even then, I think it's a real stretch to try to. The only way you could think that Obama was some sort of crazy black radical is if you just assume that any black person in politics is a crazy black radical, unless they're a Republican.
Or you're so out of touch, or you're so out of touch that you really believe this is a completely anti-business administration and some pursuing some kind of unheard of policies before and things like that, which some people are.
Yeah. But these days, today, Barack Obama is, perhaps the most known quantity in American politics. In fact, I was thinking about, I had like a brief thought about this last night, that I might expand on later, but Obama, I think Obama in 2008 was more known in terms of his biography and his views than Romney is today.
Absolutely right.
I think it's actually, I'm very hesitant to pull out race, despite the fact that I write about it quite a bit, but I think there's something very interesting about the fact that Obama was heavily scrutinized, that the question was, who is this guy? Despite the fact that he wrote a memoir, a second book on his policy views, in that he, he's been in the public eye for longer than Mitt Romney has. Obviously Romney was the son of a governor, but he didn't really enter public life until the mid-90s. But, from the moment Obama made president of Harvard Law Review, he's been sort of in the public in one way, shape, or form.
And there's some articles from the early '90s that I remember digging up and putting them up on the Prospect blog about him as a community organizer, and articles by him during that period that are totally fascinating.
Right. So I just find it I don't know, interesting. Weird.
He's also capable of some introspection, so that when he talks about himself, even if everybody is distorts things a little bit when they talk about themselves and their motives and things like that. But at least Obama, in the book and other settings, is capable of some introspection about why he is where he is and why he believes what he does. Whereas I think Romney is stunningly not. Romney just tells. My favorite one always is Romney's claim of how his family decided that he should run for president this time, which is they were sitting around the breakfast table and Romney says, Mitt, it's just so vital that we have somebody in the White House who's been a small businessman, and that's why it's essential that you run. Does anybody in the world believe that that's actually the conversation that a human family has? Whether somebody should run for president? Not to mention he's not a small businessman, so do families really just lie to each other routinely about things like that? It's kind of related, I think, to the what we know about him.
Yeah.
Thing. But, obviously, you could disqualify somebody, you could see enormous, who is this guy, doubts about somebody who's running for president for the first time. And most Americans had not heard of Barack Obama.
Right.
Maybe they'd heard of him 4 years earlier, when he gave the speech in 2004, but most people had only heard of him in 2007, maybe even just in 2008. So you could see those steps. But now, you've been president for 3.5 years. I'm always stunned by how I used to work with somebody who later actually worked in the Obama White House, who said to me that, the most important, very, very smart political person, who said the most important number in any poll is the number on does this person care about people like me, cares about people like me, which you'll see, the language can be sometimes a little different, but you can kind of trace that. And Obama's numbers on that are, consistently, for all the elitism and the distance and things that we criticize, he's sometimes criticized for, that number remains very, very high, close to 60% all the time. And, and Romney's number is never going to be anywhere close to that. It's pretty hard to discredit something. It's pretty hard to just take somebody down when you're that familiar with him and people still have that kind of favorable response to him as a human being.
And
but
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was not going to add anything. I was just going to say that, that the Obamas as a family just seem, very relatable. I guess I guess if you are like a certain age generation, to me they seem very relatable. They remind me of a lot of, different kinds of people.
Right, and to me too. No doubt about it. Absolutely. On the other hand, there are people whose worlds are not nearly as racially, at all, or the idea of somebody. I mean, they're very different. For some people, they're not like anybody.
Right.
For you and me, they're like a lot of people. And that's something to keep. That's a perspective. But here's what I want to actually dig into on the Joe Ricketts plan for this movie and these ads. And it's a campaign finance reform point. One of the things that we've always been interested in campaign finance reform is if all this outside spending, which some of it comes as a result of Citizens United, some of it is just kind of stuff that people figured out they could do. Almost like a cultural change, because Ricketts presumably not using corporate money for this; it's just his own money, and he could have done that at any time in the past. But one of the things about this is we often say this, some of this might not be that dangerous because if the messages are so contradictory to what the campaign's own message is, then the campaigns are going to do all that. They're not going to want to have outside money that's on a completely different message. I mean, this is probably not the message the Romney campaign wants to run.
Right.
So then the core question becomes the level of coordination you have between these outside spending, whether it's through groups like Carl Rose, American Crossroads, GPS, or the Democratic counterparts, Priorities USA, the degree of coordination between those groups and the campaigns, or the degree of coordination between those individual spenders and the campaigns. And if you really were able to say, if you were able to completely eliminate any kind of coordination, then politicians might actually feel like we really don't want to see this much outside spending either, because we want to control our own campaign. We want to have ownership of our campaign. This is one of the strongest arguments about campaign reform. In some ways, is candidates should own their own campaigns, and that's something that actually people on the right say as well as people on the left. In reality, of course, there's always a lot of coordination. And what's interesting here is that what I think you saw yesterday. Obviously somebody, maybe it was the people promoting the plan, the Fred Davis, maybe it was the people who wrote up the plan, or maybe it was somebody else entirely who gave it to the New York Times. And what you had in effect was you had a very strong signal from the Romney campaign, like this is not something we're interested in.
Right.
And Joe Ricketts heard that, and Joe Ricketts is not going to do this anymore. So, or so it seems. And so in effect, you had a kind of coordination out in public, right?
Right.
I mean, a message that you're not supposed to send. I mean, I'm sure anybody can pick up the phone and call anybody and say, can somebody call Joe Ricketts and tell him this is a really bad idea? I'm sure that would have happened also. But what you had is almost more easy. Right out in the open, you had a coordination around this expenditure.
Right. And it's done in a way that it's not, there's nothing illegal about any of that. It's just.
Right. Not at all. Right, leaking it is not illegal, and Romney campaign commenting on it is not illegal. But now this little problem, this thing that most of us kind of said bring it on or really or whatever has now gone away. I think, and that's an interesting little dimension of it. Let's just take a couple minutes. There's like one other interesting political story of the week that you and I have both written a fair amount about, which is AmericansElect.
Yes.
I wrote my TNR column about that last week, and this was the effort to kind of use the internet to to create this open-ended nominating process and put a third candidate on the ballot. They did the things that money could do. There's another money story, right? They did the things that money could do, which is buy access to the ballot in, I think, 27 states, and I think they were actually heading to 50. But they attracted no interest in this actual nominating process, and they've essentially now called it off because no candidate, the top vote getter of the candidates of the people who are actually seeking the AmericansElect nomination was former Governor Buddy Roemer of Louisiana, and he didn't come anywhere close to the 10,000 supporters that you're required to have, which is, as somebody pointed out, he has more people, he has far more followers on Twitter than he had people who are willing to actually do this mild gesture of voting for him on the AmericansElect platform. So that experiment, which was widely touted by Tom Friedman and others, is now done. So you have any thoughts on what the meaning of the demise of AmericansElect is?
I mean, I think there are a lot of things to say about AmericansElect. The first was that it was just sort of silly. This idea that like political parties nominate presidential candidates through a grueling, at least 2-year process, usually 3 or 4 year process. Usually, people who start usually the 4 years from the date of a presidential election is when you really have to start doing these things, and that means flying to Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina and going to every single event you can, sort of making connections throughout the country, raising money, developing an organization, staff. So the idea that you could use the internet to bypass that just seems to me a little silly. And let's say it had worked, like on Earth 4, where the AmericansElect candidate, there's a nominee and they won the presidency. They may themselves be a centrist, but how did they get anything done?
Right. It's the same kind of great man theory of history, right? That was the illusion of Obama, right? I mean, you're still working in this very, very tough institutional structure, and at least Obama had, in theory, a majority of the House and a majority of the Senate who shared his basic values, and even that didn't make life easy.
Right. I mean, I guess the underlying theory of AmericansElect is that the problem with the current system is that there's too much partisanship and there's too much polarization, that things will get done if you have someone to bring both sides. It's someone who represents the mass center and will bring people together.
Right.
But I think that both obviously it misunderstands sort of the actual problems in the American system, which have nothing to do really with ideology and everything to do with the erosion of norms and archaic institutional rules and all that jazz. That's the problem, and it would be the problem even if both the Republican and Democratic parties were just mildly. I mean, the Democratic Party is mildly center left, and the Republican Party were just mildly center right. If the Republican Party were, less conservative but just as totalistic with regards to its goals, I think you'd have similar problems. But sort of AmericansElect, I think, also misses a key part of human psychology, and that is people really like rooting against other things. And it's not, and I feel like in Washington, it's or at least in the Beltway, it's we're not supposed to admit that, but people vote because they don't like the other side. People may tell pollsters that I really want someone to believe in, but no, you really don't like the other side, and I think that's perfectly okay. I mean, that's how it is with sports. It's how it is with a lot of other things in our lives, because it's just much easier. It's much easier to gin up aggression towards the other side than really find anything affirming about yours. And AmericansElect.
Well, conflict. You need a conflict to help understand the choice.
Right. And AmericansElect, by positioning itself as being inherently without conflict, just who cares?
Right. Well, the interesting question would be is if you really, I mean, in a sense, they were as evasive. They were significantly more evasive than any of the actual parties we have.
Right.
So it would be an interesting question if AmericansElect had come out and instead of this bizarre kind of issue matrix that you were just supposed to find you're supposed to rank your priorities, education, environment, blah blah blah. I was I did it a number of times. And, I wound up saying, okay, immigration is totally unimportant to me because I'd already said education was important. That doesn't represent how anybody thinks about their actual ideological preferences at all. What's interesting would be to say, what if they said, we are about something, and the thing we're about, which is the thing they're really about, is this kind of centrist deficit reduction idea. And you could see this when they did this kind of last minute attempt to pump up David Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States and head of the Peterson Foundation, as an actual nominee. I mean, a bunch of people spun off and they created this draft Walker committee. And he never actually declared himself a candidate, but he appeared on all the shows and talked about the urgency of deficit reduction and how neither party could do this. I mean, what if you actually were the David Walker party? You were the centrist deficit reduction party, which would mean making a choice. What you stood, if the Republican Party stood for the Ryan Plan, you stood for Simpson Bowles or whatever. Would that have worked better or not? I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, I think the centrist deficit reduction party is the Democratic Party of Barack Obama. I don't have any question about that in my mind. Whether although his plan would obviously be a little more, I think, well structured. Given total power, his plan would be better structured and more humane than Simpson Bowles. But it's an interesting question whether if they actually stood for something, would they have gotten somewhere?
Right. I mean, AmericansElect and the whole sort of centrist obsession actually really just reminds me of hipster teenagers that don't really, are too cool to choose a side, or too cool to choose a preference to say they like something, so have to think of their own thing. Like, because the Democratic Party is the centrist deficit reduction party, or at least the space for that exists in a large swath of the Democratic Party. Yes, there are liberals, like there are folks like myself who think we need a more robust welfare state, and that deficit reduction should not be the top priority. But this is the debate within the Democratic Party, and so if this is something you really cared about, then it wouldn't be hard to become a Democrat and begin running candidates in primaries that share those priorities. Like, this is enough Democratic voters support it that it is. I mean, the current Democratic president supports it, that it shouldn't be a problem. But I just get the sense that like your Tom Friedmans or whatever just really don't want to call themselves Democrats, and so have to think of the hipster alternative, except it's not really a hipster alternative because it's not even cool.
Right. Well, it's interesting the degree. I mean, another example of this is somebody like Matt Miller, who's a guy about my age, worked in the Clinton administration, writes a column, and has taken this kind of. I mean, even though his actual views on things are pretty similar to my own. He's positioned himself as the person who believes the centrist third party is the way to get there.
Right.
He's taken this. Both sides are out of touch. Almost like the way he's chosen to approach the world, not necessarily as his ideology. And I've kind of come to a different way of thinking about the world. Although I could, if you change it, maybe. I mean, it's so much of it has to do with your, how you position yourself and why you think that's the way you want to present yourself in the world. And some of it comes out of journalism, and the journalist. It's easier, you can really, and you can see this even in news stories. You can write that, both parties are out of touch thing, whereas you can't, as a journalist, write only the Democratic Party gets this. Of course, you're Tom Friedman, you're a columnist, you can write that, and there's no reason not to write that. But it's kind of a comfortable pose for a lot of people as columnists in particular, and I don't know why that is. And at some point, that pose has to be shaken by the fact that there's no reality there that can attach to.
Right.
You had $45 million in AmericansElect is nothing to sniff at, and you managed to get 5,000 numbers that are almost comparable to what you see in one county in an Iowa precinct, in an Iowa caucus,
right?
Rather than anything at a national level. At some point that basic set of assumptions has to be put to the people like Friedman and Miller have to say, should I rethink this whole approach? But of course that would be heresy.
Right. I have to say, I find the idea that both parties are out of touch to be just very odd, because even with gerrymandering and safe seats and everything, people are electing these representatives. These Democratic leaders and politicians and Republican leaders and politicians just don't show up out of nowhere, right? By definition, these groups are out of touch.
Well, right. Although you could. I mean, there are a lot of reforms. There are a lot of people who could run for Congress but don't, for example,
right.
Because of money, because of a whole bunch of reasons. You and I both know there's a lot of structural reforms including campaign finance reform and other things that would make it possible for different kinds of people to be running for office, for politicians, for incumbents to face more challenges, things like that, that might make them more responsible.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Right.
But on a certain level, I just think on a certain level, both parties are a coalition of like many different interests, and like those. I guess I'm really Madisonian in my thinking, as you can probably tell, and I find the idea that somehow all of these different interests and individuals who are electing people and parties that represent those interests are like out of touch to be weird. Like you like you said, you can change the systems so that like different collections of interest are better represented.
Right.
But to say that like it's out of touch just seemed weird to me. Like.
Right, and I think if you read about American politics in the 50s or the 60s, or there's this book that just came out called The Last Great Senate that I've read some of, or the new book by Robert Draper about the House of Representatives, or whatever. You compare the eras. In a sense, the era when we got more done in American politics was when American politicians were more out of touch.
Exactly.
In fact, I mean, like the Draper. I mean, they're so constantly responding that that's in a sense where you get the paralysis from.
Right.
All right. Well, let's. I think that was good. Do you have any other topics you want to put on the table, or should we wrap this up?
I think we should wrap this up.
Okay. I feel like I haven't talked to you in a long time, so it's fun to do it in public here. So thank you again, Jamelle, and let's close this down.
Definitely.